would presently do. "And by the by, Mr. Maydig," said Mr. Fotheringay, "I might perhaps be able to help you in a domestic way." "Don't quite follow," said Mr. Maydig, pouring out a glass of miraculous old Burgundy. Mr. Fotheringay helped himself to a second Welsh rarebit out of vacancy and took a mouthful. "I was thinking," he said, "I might be able to work a miracle with Mrs. Minchkin. Make her a better woman." Mr. Maydig put down the glass and looked doubtful. She strongly objects to interference, you know, Mr. Fotheringay, and as a matter of fact, it's well past 11 and she's probably in bed and asleep. Do you think on the whole—" Mr. Fotheringay considered these objections. "I don't see that it shouldn't be done in her sleep." For a time Mr. Maydig opposed the idea, and then he yielded. Mr. Fotheringay issued his orders, and, a little less at their ease perhaps, the two gentlemen proceeded with their repast. Mr. Maydig was enlarging on the changes he might expect in his housekeeper next day, with an optimism that seemed even to Mr. Fotheringay's supper senses a little forced and hectic, when a series of confused noises from upstairs began. Their eyes exchanged interrogations, and Mr. Maydig left the room hastily. Mr. Fotheringay heard him calling up to his housekeeper, and then his footsteps going softly up to her. In a minute or so the minister returned, his step light, his face radiant. "Wonderful," he said, "and touching, most touching." He began pacing the hearth-rug. A repentance, a most touching repentance through the crack of the door, poor woman, a most wonderful change. She had got up. She must have got up at once. She'd got up out of her sleep to smash a private bottle of brandy in her box, and to confess it, too. But this it opens a most amazing vista of possibilities. If we can work this miraculous change in her— "The thing's unlimited, seemingly," said Mr. Fotheringay. "And about Mr. Winch?" "Altogether unlimited," and from the hearth-rug Mr. Maydig, waving the Winch difficulty aside, unfolded a series of wonderful proposals he invented as they went along. Now, what these proposals were does not concern the essentials of this story. Suffice it that they were designed in a spirit of infinite benevolence, the sort of benevolence that used to be called postprandial. Suffice it, too, that the problem of Winch remained unsolved, nor is it necessary to describe how far that series got to its fulfillment. There were astonishing changes. The small hours found Mr. Maydig and Mr. Fotheringay careening across the chilly market square under the still moon, in a sort of ecstasy of thaumaturgy. Mr. Maydig all flap and gesture, Mr. Fotheringay short and bristling, and no longer abashed at his greatness. They had reformed every drunkard in the parliamentary division, changed all the beer and alcohol to water. Mr. Maydig had overruled Mr. Fotheringay on this point. They had further greatly improved the railway communication of the place, drained Vindler's Swamp and improved the soil of One Tree Hill, and cured the vicar's wart. And they were going to see what could be done with the injured pier at South Bridge. "The place," gasped Mr. Maydig, "won't be the same place tomorrow. How surprised and thankful everyone will be." And just at that moment the church clock struck 3. "I say," said Mr. Fotheringay, "that's 3 o'clock. I must be getting back. I've got to be at business by 8, and besides, Mrs. Wims—" "We're only beginning," said Mr. Maydig, full of sweetness of unlimited power. "We're only beginning. Think of all the good we're doing. When people wake—" "But," said Mr. Fotheringay. Mr. Maydig gripped his arm suddenly. His eyes were bright and wild. "My dear chap," he said, "there's no hurry. Look!" He pointed to the moon at the zenith. "Joshua." "Joshua?" said Mr. Fotheringay. "Joshua," said Mr. Maydig. "Why not stop it?" Mr. Fotheringay looked at the moon. "That's a bit tall," he said, after a pause. "Why not?" said Mr. Maydig. "Of course it doesn't stop. You stop the rotation of the earth, you know. Time stops. It isn't as if we were doing harm." Said Mr. Fotheringay. "Well," he sighed, "I'll try. Here." He buttoned up his jacket and addressed himself to the habitable globe with as good an assumption of confidence as lay in his power. "Just stop rotating, will you?" said Mr. Fotheringay. Incontinently he was flying head over heels through the air at the rate of dozens of miles a minute. In spite of the innumerable circles he was describing per second, he thought, for thought is wonderful, sometimes as sluggish as flowing pitch, sometimes as instantaneous as light. He thought in a second and willed, "Let me come down safe and sound. Whatever else happens, let me down safe and sound." He willed it only just in time, for his clothes, heated by his rapid flight through the air, were already beginning to singe. He came down with a forcible but by no means injurious bump in what appeared to be a mound of fresh-turned earth. A large mass of metal and masonry, extraordinarily like the clock tower in the middle of the market square, hit the earth near him, ricocheted over him, and flew into stonework, bricks, and masonry like a bursting bomb. A hurtling cow hit one of the larger blocks and smashed like an egg. There was a crash that made all the most violent crashes of his past life seem like the sound of falling dust, and this was followed by a descending series of lesser crashes. A vast wind roared throughout the earth and heaven so that he could scarcely lift his head to look. For a while he was too breathless and astonished even to see where he was or what had happened, and his first movement was to feel his head and reassure himself that his streaming hair was still his own. "Lord," gasped Mr. Fotheringay, scarce able to speak for the gale, "I've had a squeak. What's gone wrong? Storms and thunder, and only a minute ago a fine night. It's Maydig sent me on this sort of thing. What a wind! If I go on fooling in this way, I'm bound to have a thundering accident. Where's Maydig? What a confounded mess everything's in." He looked about him as far as his flapping jacket would permit. The appearance of things was really extremely strange. "The sky's all right, anyhow," said Mr. Fotheringay, "and that's about all that is right. And even there it looks like a terrific gale coming up. But there's the moon overhead just as it was just now, bright as midday. But as for the rest, where's the village? Where's anything? And what on earth set this wind a-blowing? I didn't order no wind." Mr. Fotheringay struggled to get to his feet in vain, and after one failure remained on all fours holding on. He surveyed the moonlit world to leeward and the tails of his jacket streaming over his head. "There's something seriously wrong," said Mr. Fotheringay, "and what it is goodness knows." Far and wide nothing was visible in the white glare through the haze of dust that drove before a screaming gale but tumbled masses of earth and heaps of inchoate ruins, no trees, no houses, no familiar shapes, only a wilderness of disorder vanishing at last into the darkness beneath the whirling columns and streamers, the lightnings and the thunderings of a swiftly rising storm. Near him in the vivid glare was something that might once have been an elm tree, a smashed mass of splinters shivered from boughs to base, and further a twisted pile of iron girders, only too evidently the viaduct rose out of the piled confusion. You see, when Mr. Fotheringay had arrested the rotation of the solid globe, he had made no stipulation concerning the trifling movables upon its surface. And the earth spins so fast that the surface at its equator is traveling at rather more than 1,000 miles an hour, and in these latitudes at more than half that pace. So when the village, and Mr. Maydig, and Mr. Fotheringay, and everybody and everything had been jerked violently forward at about 9 miles per second, that is to say much more violently than if they'd been fired out of a cannon, and every human being, every living creature, every house, and every tree, all the world as we know it, had been so jerked and smashed and utterly destroyed, that was all. These things Mr. Fotheringay did not, of course, fully appreciate, but he perceived that his miracle had miscarried, and with that a great distrust of miracles came upon him. He was in darkness now, for the clouds had swept together and blotted out his momentary glimpse of the moon, and the air was full of fitful, struggling, tortured wraiths of hail. A great roaring of wind and waters filled earth and sky, and peering under his hand through the dust and sleet to windward, he saw by the play of the lightnings a vast wall of water pouring towards him. "Maydig!" screamed Mr. Fotheringay's feeble voice amid the elemental uproar. "Here, Maydig!" "Stop!" cried Mr. Fotheringay to the advancing water. "Oh, for goodness' sake, stop!" "Just a moment," said Mr. Fotheringay to the lightnings and thunder. "Stop just a moment while I collect my thoughts. And now what shall I do?" he said. "What shall I do, Lord? I wish Maydig was about." "I know," said Fotheringay, "and for goodness' sake, let's have it right this time." He remained on all fours, leaning against the wind, very intent to have everything right. "Ah," he said, "let nothing what I'm going to order until I say off. Lord, I wish I'd thought of that before." He lifted his little voice against the whirlwind, shouting louder and louder in the vain desire to hear himself speak. "Now then, here goes. Mind about that what I said just now. In the first place, when all I've got to say is done, let me lose my miraculous power. Let my will become just like anybody else's will, and all these dangerous miracles be stopped. I don't like them. I'd rather I didn't work 'em ever so much. That's the first thing. And the second is, let me be back just before the miracles began. Let everything be just as it was before that blessed lamp turned up. It's a big job, but it's the last. Have you got it? No more miracles. Everything as it was. Me back in the Long Dragon just before I drank my half-pint. That's it. Yes." He dug his fingers into the mold, closed his eyes, and said, "Off." Everything became perfectly still. He perceived that he was standing erect. "So you say," said a voice. He opened his eyes. He was in the bar of the Long Dragon, arguing about miracles with Toddy Beamish. He had a vague sense of some great thing forgotten that instantaneously passed. You see, except for the loss of his miraculous powers, everything was back as it had been. His mind and memory, therefore, were now just as they had been at the time when the story began, so that he knew absolutely nothing of all that is told here, knows nothing of all that is told here to this day, and among other things, of course, he still did not believe in miracles. "I tell you that miracles, properly speaking, can't possibly happen," he said. "Whatever you like to hold, and I am prepared to prove it up to the hilt." "That's what you think," said Toddy Beamish, "and prove it if you can." "Look'ee here, Mr. Beamish," said Mr. Fotheringay. "Let us clearly understand what a miracle is. It's something contrariwise to the course of nature, done by the power of will." And that's Story Spieler for today. Join us next week. I'm your narrator, Roy Trumbull.